most of all, develop the inner strength, because fall is inevitable, but maybe it can just be a slip instead of a fall. And then you can go right back to focusing on God. Good morning, everyone. So there's a famous yoga pose, which all of you have heard of. It's called the headstand. And what we do in the headstand, of course, is instead of standing on our 2 feet, we stand on our head. And when we teach that pose, we don't spend too much time teaching how to stand on the head, because you know why. Believe it or not, it's fairly straightforward. You just stand on your head. That's pretty much the instruction. But we spend most of our time teaching how not to fall when you're about to stand on your head. Because when you're up there, you're kind of merrily standing on your head, feeling good about yourself, and some little disturbance happens. And the gravity begins to pull you down. And at that point, if you don't know what to do, the pull of gravity is such that it builds on itself, and the fear of falling enhances the probability that you will fall. And because the mind really wants to come back and say, what is this? I want to stand on my 2 feet. No standing on the head business for me. So this is almost a perfect metaphor for the spiritual life. The paths to enlightenment, liberation, moksha, whatever you want to call it, is not that hard. Let me say it differently. What did I just say? No, actually, let me say it that way. That is what I meant to say. Inherently, it's not that hard. And this path has been captured in small, pithy phrases. Be still and know that I am. Aham Brahmasmi. I am divine within myself, and so on. Absent other factors, this itself is fairly straightforward. But what makes it hard is that there is this counteracting force of gravity, which is delusion, Maya, individualized as ignorance, whatever you want to call it, Satan. That thing's pulling us back, and it has a sense of familiarity because of lifetimes of accepting that as the reality, that suddenly, instead of standing on our head, we want to come back and stand on our feet as soon as that little inner doubt begins. And as we saw in today's reading quite dramatically, that nobody is immune to it. The Master pointed out, and Swami emphasized in the reading today. Master is a Paramahansa Yogananda, whose teachings we follow here, and Swami Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda. They pointed out repeatedly that Judas was a very advanced soul. He had to be to come as part of the inner circle, one of the chosen 12 of Jesus. How can he be anything other than very advanced? Peter, perhaps Jesus' most favorite disciple, and perhaps the most favorite disciple of the people that read the Bible, very endearing. It is said that he was prone to anger. Now we can pigeonhole them and kind of say, wow, that Judas, a bad dude. And Peter, he still has a ways to go. You could do that. But it's better to kind of think and say, if those guys, if Judas is tempted, if Peter gets angry, what about me? Where do I stand in this zeitgeist of spiritual landscape? There is, as Hriman was guiding his meditation about forest and imagining a being coming through the forest, I was smiling. I was meditating, of course, sincerely, but I was also smiling because that's the story I want to tell you, and to tell you the story about a forest and a being that comes in there. It's a very weird scripture, yoga scripture in India. It's called the Yoga Vasishtha. It's massive. And it's filled with these illustrations that if life is a delusion, if you are always tempted, if you keep coming back life after life, then what would be the true consequences? There are these marvelous, mind-blowing Matrix in the movie, Matrix-like stories that it's filled with. And one of the stories in there is, like all stories, it begins a long, long time ago in a forest. And in this deep, dark forest, in the skies above the forest, above the canopy, we find a young boy. He's self-realized. Even though his body is young, he is liberated because he is the son of the great sage Narada himself. And this young boy is kind of walking in the sky, just transporting himself, going in some divinely ordained business. And there is an aura of light surrounding him. And the boy, in his omniscience, he looks down and says, somebody down there needs my help. And the boy descends down into the ashram, meaning a hermitage. And there he finds a man who is performing austerities, meaning all kinds of rites of self-denial in order to find enlightenment. But he looks very unhappy, not the kind of thing that you would expect in a person like that. So the boy goes up to him and says, "Sir, who are you? Give me an account of yourself." And he can demand that because he's a God-realized soul. And this man realizes that. And he says, "Young sir, until some time ago I was a king. And I had a big kingdom, a large treasury, a very powerful army, great wealth, and my beloved wife. I had all of that, but deep inside of me, I knew that if this were my focus, then that would lead me to pain and suffering. So I gave up my wealth. I traded my throne for this seat in the forest. And I have, with a single-minded goal of enlightenment, I have practiced these austerities for years. I have denied myself food and water. I don't rest even for a little bit. And yet, after many years of this, I feel lonely. I feel helpless. I'm poor and therefore I have no friends. Even though I haven't missed my practice for a single day, I feel pensive, depressed, and moody." And this young boy looks at him and he says, "You know, King, your plight reminds me of what happened to an elephant, which was in a forest similar to this. It's this great, big, powerful elephant that used to roam the forest, and it was the head of a large herd of elephants. And it had these tusks that were so strong that they were like thunderbolts from the heaven. And they were stunningly long and curved and white in color, and they resembled twin flashes of lightning. And they were so sharp that it could uproot a tree." A hunter was watching this elephant. He was a coward. He's like a fox, a scheming, wily person. He wanted the tusks. He couldn't confront the elephant. He wasn't strong enough or courageous enough for that. But he schemed, set up a great big trap, and one day the elephant walked into the trap. And as the trap clamped, it was the kind of trap that was an iron goad, an iron staff that impaled its trunk and trapped it. And it was trapped with chains and other things. It was very painful. The elephant suffered for 3 days and 3 nights, and the hunter is watching, waiting, so that he can get to the ivory. But the elephant was so powerful that on the 4th day, it opened its mouth and growled, which was like the sound of thunderclap coming across the sky. And with its great tusks and the heave of its mighty body, it broke this goad of iron and freed its trunk. And then as it shook its body one by one, the chains that were binding it began to break. So great was its strength. The hunter He ran up to a nearby tree, climbed up the tree. He wanted to jump on the elephant's head because that's the vulnerable spot. And so he jumped from the tree, but he mistimed it, and he fell at the foot of the elephant. And this great elephant, now in need, could taste victory, and then it saw this hunter at its feet and lifted its great foot to trample him underneath. And in the last minute, it withdrew and said, "It is not brave of me to kill this man who is helpless at my foot." And so, and the hunter's looking at the foot coming down at him, and he's trembling with fear. He knows he's about to die, but suddenly he's spared. And the elephant gives one final shake of its great body, breaks the final chains that are binding it, and with a trumpet of victory, it walks away into the forest. You think this is a good thing. It isn't, because here what happens next. The hunter now, he finds that he's pain-free, even though he fell from such a great height. And when he gets up, he feels he's stronger than before, because the wicked get stronger by their acts of wickedness. And he stalks the elephant day and night. And the elephant finds another beautiful grove in the forest, and that's its resting place. And the hunter stalks the elephant, goes and digs a great big pit very silently, stealthily, and covers the pit with very juicy grass, and all around it, he puts tasty leaves and plants to lure the elephant. And one day, sure enough, the elephant goes, finds these juicy plants and all other treats, nettles, and goes in and begins to eat it and walks towards the pit. And like a great rock falling from the top of a cliff into the ocean, it falls into the pit. And it lies there, lonely, helpless, devoid of food and water. And the young boy, filled with compassion, he tells the king, who was the unhappy renunciant, he says, "O king, you are like that elephant." The hunter is delusion, maya, always waiting to ensnare you and to trap you. He knows your weaknesses. What he wants are your tusks. Your tusks are the twin qualities of renunciation and reasoning. And your trunk is the quality of introspection. That's what the hunter wants, because without that, you're powerful and under his control. And you, with great self-control, you used your power of renunciation and reasoning and gave up your kingdom and came into the forest. And at that point, Delusion, the hunter, trembled because he knew he was about to be killed. But then your ego was with you. You felt invulnerable, that having achieved this spiritual victory, you thought nobody could touch you anymore. And you walked away, and the hunter got more powerful. Your delusion got more powerful. You've come into the forest. You've given up everything. But you're carrying with you the pride of having renounced everything. You crave other people's adoration, their admiration of what you did. And so you feel friendless, you feel lonely, and you're now here in this pit of useless austerities, just like that elephant, suffering through it. Hearing the words of this boy, the king, who was the unhappy renunciant, grows silent. And like rain that washes away the dirt on the ground, his mind was washed away with the last vestiges of temptation and desire. He glows with the inner light of wisdom and enters into samadhi, and his body becomes still as an image carved out of wood. Now, isn't that an interesting story? You wouldn't think that that would be the ending, that good things would happen to the elephant. But you see, that's the warning. It contains two important lessons for us of how to detect the fall. The first one is, don't take any blessing, any spiritual victory that you might achieve for granted. That's what Jesus meant when he said, For me you shall not have with you always. Maybe you will see God and not be ensnared by delusion, but chances are we will be. So be vigilant. The second lesson is the trajectory, and this is where it gets very nuanced but also very interesting. The Bhagavad Gita verse quoted in today's reading is one of the most famous ones. It's from chapter 2, verses 62 and 63. And it goes like this in Sanskrit. Dhyayato vishayan pumsaha sangasteshu upajayate sangat sanjayate kamah kamat krodho bhijayate krodhat bhavati sammohah sammohat smriti vibhramaha smriti bhramshat buddhinasho buddhinashat pranashyati. And directly translated, as you heard in the reading today, it means dwelling on sensory objects, external objects, creates attachment to them, and from attachment sprouts desire. That it's already a little bit irreversible, it's sprouting. And when desire is not fulfilled, anger is inflamed. It comes like an overwhelming, unpreventable whoosh kind of flame. And that from there, infatuation, anger leads to infatuation, which that's kind of an interesting thing. I'm sure we've all been infatuated with something or other before. When I was young, at my teenage years, I was infatuated by a few girls, as people of that age tend to be. And once that infatuation sets in, it's like whatever she did was so right and so appealing and so adorable that you see the entire universe through this rosy lens of infatuation, and you have to have it, you gotta have it. That's infatuation. He says infatuation appears. Krodhat bhavati sammohaha. Bhava means appear, it's there, it's already unpreventable. And from there, we lose sight of who we are, our own reality, like it happened to the king, that he came there with the lofty purpose of renunciation and enlightenment, but was infatuated with the need to be admired for what he did. And says, once that happens, this twin of infatuation and loss of true purpose, then you lose the sense of right and wrong. I don't care what it takes, I gotta have it. You see? And smriti bhramshat buddhinasho and buddhinashat pranashyati. Now you have fallen. That's the it's a very nuanced trajectory, and of course whomever speaks next week will talk about how to reverse that trajectory. But for this week, I want to land on a bit of a slightly different point. Now, does this mean that the spiritual path is this knife's edge where we question every attachment we have, we analyze every time the mind inflames in anger, and we worry about eternal hellfire and damnation every time we crave a piece of chocolate? Is it really that kind of a knife's edge? It would be a very sad thing if that were indeed the case. Now, there is some, the sword of introspection, it's very important. I'm not saying it shouldn't be there, but there is another way of looking at it. That is that Yogananda said repeatedly in various different contexts that even to come into a lifetime where you say, I see God, there is something wrong with where I am and I see God, that is already an advanced state of consciousness, that some of the karmic burden that we've taken 5-8 million lifetimes to aggregate, much of that has already gone. And Swami said we come into this life to learn maybe 1 or 2 lessons, and it's focusing on that. All of these other things, these cravings, temptations, anger, desire, whatever you want to call them, they are more often than not traced back to these one or two lessons that we've come here in this lifetime to learn. Then the question is, how do you find out what that is? Well, Swamiji gives clues strewn among his various writings, but one way is to, I think, if the narrative of your life has the phrase "if only" in it, it's time to pause. Say, if only I had my finances in order, if only my health was at this particular level, if only this aspect of my relationship righted itself, then I'd have the life that I'd want. I'm not asking for much. I'm not asking for $1 million, if only. Then it's time to look at that if only and say, perhaps that's what I have incarnated in this life, is not so much to fulfill that if only, but to cut the cord that infatuates me with that if only. That maybe it is not if only getting the finances in order so that my Excel spreadsheet comes out with a positive number the day before I die, but perhaps it's to go a little bit beyond that and say, that belongs to you, God, not to me. So the if onlys is one clue. The second one is, again, if you find yourself with the same piece of negativity that comes through various times in your life, through various stages in your life, maybe, I do all this repeatedly, I am abandoned, I am betrayed, I have this regret about this, or I face a challenge and repeatedly I get all anxious about it. Now that should be alarm bells going off, because Yogananda said that Satan, this delusive influence, works with our down-pulling tendencies and amplifies them. And so when we have these negative tendencies that repeatedly limit us in life, it's time to ask, how much energy am I giving this? Is my job here to transcend that tendency rather than try to control the circumstance so that it doesn't show up anymore? You see what I'm saying? Yogananda gave this imagery, well, many people have, but he too said there is Satan sitting on one shoulder and God sitting on the other shoulder, and who do you listen to? So working with those if-onlys and negative tendencies will give a valuable clue to maybe the one or the two lessons that we are here, because we are already fairly far along. And who knows, like in the case of that king who was an unhappy monk, all it needed was the boy's words in the story of an elephant, and he was already there, and he went into samadhi. Maybe it is that close. Who's to say? Why not? But there is another third component, and this is what I'll end with, is there is a parable of the weed, not the weed, the weeds. I say parable of the weed. It maybe means something different. Parable of the weeds, and it comes in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's a very straightforward parable. It says there's a farmer that plants a whole bunch of wheat, and his enemies come in and plant a whole bunch of weed next to it. And the farmer doesn't know this, and after a few days, weeks, I don't know how long it takes for wheat and wheat to sprout, but whenever that is, his helpers come in and say, "Sir, there are weeds. Your enemies have planted it." And the farmer says, "Well, shall we remove it?" And the farmer says, No, let it be, because if you uproot the weeds now, you might uproot the wheat as well. It's not strong enough. And at harvest time, you can uproot it and burn it. And Yogananda gave a marvelous explanation for this, of the underlying meaning of this. He said that the wheat represents the fruit of our meditative practices, those inner tendencies that get strengthened as a result of our sadhana, the meditation that we do and other things that we do on the spiritual path, seva and the satsang and devotion, and let that grow. Don't give too much energy to the weeds, the negative tendencies, because then there may not be enough left to work on strengthening yourself. That's when we teach headstand, that's what we do, is we teach people core strength. Because when the fall begins, you kind of use your center, come back to your center and say, nope, not falling, right there. It's only a slip, not a fall, as Swami Kriyananda used to say. So that's the important aspect of it is, yes, there is this karmic battle that's being fought, and yes, there is the danger of falling, and yes, be aware of the if-onlys and the negative tendencies, but also, most of all, develop the inner strength, because fall is inevitable, but maybe it can just be a slip instead of a fall, and then you can go right back to focusing on God. Thank you.